Look, it can be a hard world, but I assure you, if you just watch the video of Gabriel Martinelli being welcomed back to training by Win the Dog, everything will be fine. This is the ArsenalVision Post-Match Podcast. My name is Elliot Smith, the Black Man on Twitter. Yank Gunner. Hello, everybody. How you doing? Kind of settling into this transfer window? In the lull now. It's getting boring. Bought Havertz, bought Rice, bought Timber, snooze fest. Now we just sit and wait for it to be announced. Nothing going on, but the players are back. Training is going on. We are getting closer to being able to have the first preseason game where we determine that all of these buys were terrible. So that's going to be fun. Can't wait. I mean, the intensity with which we are going to scrutinize every minute of preseason is a little bit frightening, but also a little bit fun, and I'm excited for it because it also means the tour will start, and when the tour starts, that means I get to go travel around a bit and see everybody, and I'm very much looking forward to that. I know the much anticipated news of the LA event that has been referenced many, many times but never detailed is soon to be detailed. In fact, I have a meeting today that will hopefully nail down the details of that event that is now, I want to say, 19 days away, so probably best to get some information out to you, and we will definitely do that. Tim will be coming up down the line. We're going to talk a bit of Arsene Wenger, as he is set to have a statue at the Emirates, and I think it's fair to say the guy earned it. So we will talk a little bit about that, a little bit about training as well. If you have not seen the video of Gabriel Martinelli being welcomed back by Win the Dog, I don't know how I feel about the name Win for a dog. I mean, it's cute. It's cute. There were other names you could have gone with. The dog is adorable, and having a dog around Arsenal is a beautiful thing, and I think the more the better. So what we're going to do first, though, is we're going to talk a little bit about the approach Arsenal have taken in this transfer window, the degree to which we've separated ourselves from the chasing pack to be that team chasing Manchester City, and where we sit in that cluster of big clubs and what the big clubs are trying to do. Because I think it's fun to zoom out a little bit and see, where are we? What kind of progress are we making? Where do we need to go? What still remains to be done? So we're going to do that all with a good friend of mine, Tom Canton, who you can find on Twitter at Tom Canton Media. And you can find his writing at Football.London, where he is the Arsenal writer, and I recommend you read his fine work there. You can also find him on the Gooner Talk on YouTube, obviously, which is where he is quite popular. If you're not on the YouTubes, he's a YouTuber, and if you're not watching, I think you can see why he's a dashing man himself, a young man, I dare say. And it is a great pleasure now for me to wrap up this awkward introduction and say hello to Tom. Hi, Tom.
Yeah, I've been introduced a few times, but that's probably my favorite, not because I'm egotistical in any way, shape, or form, but no, that was great. I loved it.
Yeah. No man who looks like you and is coiffed like you has an ego, I assure you. You don't get that way by not concentrating on your physical appearance. I have put the effort into my physical appearance. It just hasn't borne the dividends. I'm like that player who works really hard in training, but it doesn't really make much of a difference on the pitch. So it's okay.
That Olivier Giroud advert, do you remember where he was like, I cannot help that I'm gorgeous? I'm not on that level at all. But that's what I felt you would introduce him like if you were doing the same introduction.
See, that's the difference between me and Olivier. I can help it. And I do. So, I do. Well, Tom, firstly, let's go super high level. I think we kind of know Declan Rice is supposedly having a medical maybe as soon as tomorrow, announcement then maybe over the weekend or next week. Jurrien Timber seems like that's done. Kai Havertz is done, obviously. And then I think there's going to be a pause as players exit before we maybe take a beat and look at potentially another midfielder or other targets. Just give me an overall, if all we do are the three signings that I just referenced and the outgoings that I think we expect, out of 10, roughly, where do you think that puts the transfer window?
Well, obviously, it depends upon who those outgoings are. So I think if we're expecting those outgoings to be Xhaka, who's, we're expecting an announcement on that by Leverkusen very soon. Thomas Partey, potentially. Could be one of those. Kieran Tierney could be one of those. Following Balogun, of course, another high-profile player in the squad now that could move on. And there's a smattering of less high-profile options that I think we're all aware of who those names are. Potentially a 8, I think, because I think that if it is to be just, say, Rice and Havertz as midfield additions, and it seems that Arteta's referencing Havertz as a midfielder, I think losing Xhaka and Partey and adding Rice and Havertz, in terms of individuality, I can see a step forwards especially in terms of age, in terms of what they'll bring in the long term for Arsenal and the way in which they're expected to grow and develop and improve into their prime. Whereas Partey and Xhaka, you know what you're going to get from those. You're unlikely to see too much progression in them individually. But in terms of numbers, I always felt at the start of the window that we needed to reinforce Xhaka and Partey. So to swap them out 1 for 1 and then to not bring anything else in, I think still leaves us somewhat short for a season where you're going in to play the Champions League, that you're looking to try and compete with the most ridiculous club on the planet in Man City again. And there's an expectation from fans they want to see us progress further in the cup competitions as well. So all of that, I think, means that I can't suggest it's a perfect window, even though what we've done is brilliant. There is no denying what we've done so far is great, but I feel as though more needs to be done depending on those potential outgoings.
Yeah, it's interesting because let's take Timber out of the equation for a minute. On their own, I am very excited by Rice and Havertz. I know some people are on the fence about Havertz a bit. I find it to be a very exciting signing. I think the talent level of the player is certainly worth getting excited about. Whether he can find his best form and get out of the little bit of a lull he was in, especially this past season with Chelsea, is a question. But if you just look at it as a two in, 2 out, Xhaka and Partey out, Havertz and Rice in, it is interesting because Xhaka and Partey were 2 standout performers this season, not just for Arsenal, but in the league. And there is every possibility that both Havertz and Rice would struggle to match the form that Xhaka and Partey produced. It is not outside the realm of possibility that swap, just that 2 for 2 swap, could actually slightly lower our performance. I mean, that is possible. And that is always the possibility with transfers. I mean, here's the thing. I don't care who you buy. There is the chance it doesn't work out at the level you think. In fact, there's been a lot of studies done on the big expensive transfers, and they tend to be no better than a coin flip at times. Now, I like both of the signings we're making, and I think that they are a smart way to allocate our resources. I want to be clear about that. The interesting thing for me, I think, where you would say they would be an improvement. Granted, Xhaka, I think, outperformed expectations as a goal scorer and assist provider, certainly, and he did a brilliant job. But I still think, just qualitatively, when I watched games this season, especially against low blocks, there were times where Xhaka in the final third, you could see that it wasn't necessarily the natural position for him. And there were opportunities where Martinelli could have been more involved, maybe link up with Gabriel Jesus could have been a little tighter, that there may have been opportunities for goals. And one thing that was really neat over on the Patreon side, Giant Gooner did a season-long data review. The left 8 was the position that was making more of the in-the-box runs. And that makes sense, right? Because Martinelli plays out wide. Saka tucks in a little bit more. And that left 8's job is to fill that 4th channel inside the box. And I think Havertz can give us something a little bit more there. On the Rice side of it, I think the clear upgrade, if you set aside just talent and capability, because there were 3/4 of the season last year where I regard Thomas Partey as one of the best midfielders in all of football. It is the case that 2 of our seasons consecutively have somewhat fallen apart due to players not being available. Mikel Arteta referenced it himself, and if all Rice gives us is more availability, that will certainly be an improvement. So I do see how these were the right areas to target, and I do think that these players were the right players to target. It is always tricky when you swap out players with known qualities and known roles in the team for new players. In terms of looking around at the rest of the squad, though, I think one area that you could certainly point to would be maybe that forward position and maybe right-sided forward. It looks like Reece Nelson has signed a new deal. And Fuller and Balogun very much being talked about as an outgoing, as Eddie Nketiah looks, I think, poised to stay. With all the competitions we're going to be in, as you referenced, forwards tend to be the position, I think, where there's the most swapping, the most ability to get a lot by having a lot of players, right? I mean, if you look at City, everyone talks about they rotate so much, but Rodri played the most outfield minutes of any of their players, outfield players, right? I think that position tends not to rotate. I think that we could see the same thing with like a Declan Rice. The forwards rotate around a lot. Do we have enough in quality and numbers in that group, you think, to sustain the kind of 55-game campaign we might be facing?
Yeah, I certainly think greater than last season would be the baseline to start off that conversation. And that was always going to be the aim moving forwards. What Rice gives you is reliability. This is a guy that plays. I think there was only 16 players in the Premier League last season with more minutes than Declan Rice. So you will get with him that assurance that he is going to play for you regularly. He's going to be available for you regularly. I mean, go and watch him do his ACL now in pre-season, of course. Now, I've said that, obviously.
This time it's on you, though, because I've jinxed that kind of stuff about 100 times. So I'm going to just put it all on you at this point, Tom. Yeah,
absolutely. That's fine. I'll take it. But I think what you'll get with that group is options that Mikel Arteta can rely upon consistently and that he can choose to use in different positions as well. I think that I spoke to Jacob Steinberg at The Guardian the other day, and he would talk a lot about how Rice's explosiveness from midfield has maybe been, in some ways, restricted by the deep defensive midfield role that he plays alongside Souček, and that if he's allowed to play a little bit more expressively, that you'll see him doing that burst forwards. When Rice gets going, he's very, very difficult to stop from going. It's fantastic at driving the ball forwards. And what he's started to develop in the last season in particular is what he does when he gets to the end of that run. Whether it's a shot, whether it's a pass into the middle, whether it's just stopping and trapping the ball and holding it up and then looking up for an option. He's becoming a lot more astute in those decision-making options. But to go back to the question around rotation, I think that that's the biggest question mark for Mikel Arteta, more so than the squad. I think the options are there for him more so than ever before. But the question mark is around whether or not Mikel Arteta is, as a coach, going to be capable enough and confident enough to change what last season I was probably the most critical of all of his traits. I think he's a brilliant coach. I adore the guy. But as a guy that's only 3.5 years into a job, there are still going to be aspects that you will develop and improve at as you.
Yeah, you'd hope so.
Imagine if this was the peak of Arteta,
No, you want him to keep layering skills and qualities and improvements on his role. Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. And so that element of rotation and, making sure we take players off after 60, 70 minutes when we can. And, I've always been a little bit critical of maybe there are times in games where you can use a player that's not been given too many minutes, but he kind of is tempted sometimes to just still throw on a player that's got loads of minutes already. And I'd quite like to see some more experimentation. But now we're in a squad where you're going to see pretty much everyone on that bench, if fit, is a competitive option for us. And the other side of beyond rotation is, of course, substitutions. And substitutions is something that he needs, I think, to improve at. And that will embody something of an evolution in Arteta if next season we progress as we have done with our philosophy and our style, but also in regard to whether or not he can successfully interchange lineups, tweak things for opponents, and also go 3 to 4 days changes and it be effective enough for us to stay consistent in form.
Yeah, I think we averaged the latest first sub of any team with the fewest changes to a first 11 lineup. Now, those are also benefits because I think that explains part of the excellent season we had, the continuity that we had. What I think we've seen in consecutive seasons is when we start to get close to achieving or being in position to achieve the ultimate goal that we have for the season, Mikel tightens up a little bit in terms of who he trusts. 2 seasons ago, we were chasing top 4 and we were in the favored position to get it. And it was starting to be pretty clear that Lacazette was not giving us enough in attack. And I think by the time we reacted to that, it was maybe a little late, right, to make that change. This season, I'm not sure, but I think some people would say that he stuck with Holding as the Saliba replacement just a little too long. Maybe went with Nketiah a little too long at center forward when things started to dip. But of course, you're nitpicking in a season where at the time we were on pace for high 90-point total. And I get it, because in that moment, your feeling is like, I don't want to touch anything. I don't want to touch anything, because if this alchemy that I've figured out somehow gets disturbed, what will happen? And that's the relentlessness that City has that I think makes it difficult to be a manager trying to win a title up against City, because it may be 94 points. That's not enough. It may be 96 points. That's not enough, right? And so you find yourself probably making decisions that are unnatural because you're so concerned about every single little fine margin and the pressure of that. But yeah, I tend to agree. And that's where I look and I say, when push comes to shove, and now it's Champions League and not Europa League in particular, Is Nketiah going to be enough? Is Reece Nelson going to be enough? Trossard, I think, is a good 12th or 13th man type player. I think we saw some real quality from him as a false nine. I think we saw maybe a little bit of a limitation for him as a left winger for us, because I don't think he's a fifth channel guy. I think he's more of an interior, right? Like fourth channel guy. I think we could use maybe another stretcher type forward, or, another person who can stretch the pitch a little bit from the edges. You're really nitpicking, though. It looks like a really good squad. And I think the thing we have to remind ourselves is we're still way ahead of pace. And now we're spending at a level we never expected. And so if 3 seasons ago you said this is where we would be with the squad in 3 summers, I would have been over the moon. But now that we think we're ready to compete for a title, you want the finishing pieces there. And to be fair, you don't know how long your window is going to be open. So you don't have the luxury of just saying, well, it's still a season too early. Don't worry. We'll get the last pieces next window. And so that's a bit of a tricky one. I still think that there are moves out there for us to make, but one more attacking player could be interesting. I'll throw something a little silly out at you, but there've been some comments that Pepe had to basically beg to leave on loan last summer, that Mikel rates him, that they have a good relationship. There's been a bit of stuff that's been out there in the ether. I don't know if you've reported on any of it, but I guess what I would ask you is, could there be a remontada on the cards for like a Nico Pepe? Is that a guy who, because he plays from the right, we don't really have that natural Saka backup. Could that be a guy who, I'm not saying gets 2,000 minutes, but gets 1,500 and has a role to play? I mean, he's certainly worth more to us in this squad, I would say, than loaned out, because he fills a role we don't really naturally necessarily have. And if we have to pay him, we might as well pay him to contribute.
Yeah, it's really difficult to see Nicola Pepe in this Arsenal squad, in an totally Arteta squad. I think that what we learned from Nicolas Pepe when he first joined is that there's obvious talent there. I think those 2 words, obvious talent, were used, so much in relation to talking about Nicolas Pepe. The question mark around him was always, does he fit into what Arteta, who inherited him, not bought him, wants from a winger? And the answer is no. The difference between him and Saka, whilst Pepe was known for being this technically impressive, a guy that can pull off a skill or two, is that he still struggled in beating 2 or 3. He could beat a man sometimes, but when he got to the second or the third in the Premier League, it really was a bit of a challenge for him. Whereas Bukayo Saka knows inside out what to do in different scenarios. He'll spin you, he'll lean into you and turn away from you, and he's got a lower centre of gravity than Pepe as well, and I think he uses that to his advantage. And Saka is just technically on a different level of understanding this league than what ultimately Nicolas Pepe is. It's an interesting point about, is he worth more to us now than going on loan? Well, with 1 year left on his contract, if he goes on loan, you're losing him for nothing, and you've got a loan fee for a season.
That was coming anyway, right? I mean, do we see a sale on the cards? I think that's going to be a hard sale to generate, because the clubs that would want him can't pay his current wage, so exactly. He's likely going to want the Bosman, and we likely aren't going to find a buyer on the wage he's on, because the buyer's probably going to be somewhere like the Bundesliga or France, and they just don't pay those wages.
No, when he went to Nice, he took a 25% pay cut, and I believe that Nice covered the 50%, and then Arsenal covered another 25% of the initial wage. Was my understanding. So even moving to a club like Nice, they were only paying half of what Arsenal were paying him, and I kind of predicted that he, alongside Cedric, would be the last of what Edu describes as, in quotation marks, investments, however way you look at them. And I think they have been necessary for this club to move forward. In the same way, these investments. Like
Dogecoin was an investment that, I'm rethinking at this time. Yeah, fair.
Just now, you're rethinking that one.
Just now we're thinking Dogecoin.
But, I mean, maybe that's why we've still got Pepe, because we're still thinking about Nicolas Pepe. But, I think Arsenal will struggle to get any kind of fee. They'll certainly be hopeful. I think if people are expecting quick movements on some of the exits, I think they're going to be disappointed. I think that this window and the players that we've got that we want to move on lend themselves towards players that tend to move towards the end of the window when clubs have missed out on their primary targets and they're looking for opportunities and they're looking for an easy deal that a club are willing to do. I expect, if it's not to be a termination and it's not agreed earlier, that Pepe, Cedric, potentially Lokonga maybe, unless he does secure that low move to Burnley. Nuno Tavares, of course, being another one. That these types of players will move towards the end of the window in the last few weeks or so. So don't. Even though we're expecting kind of a bit of a lull now after these three big signings and Edu to work on outgoings, it doesn't mean that they will happen immediately, and it might take the season to start and injuries to happen for certain clubs for these players to then get picked up. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, the latest we heard on Cedric is that he supposedly wants to fight for his place, which is a scary thought for a team competing for a title, with respect. But yeah, I just hope that the deal for Xhaka, which was £21.5 million, was a lot of money when considering we signed him for less than double that. I
think it's a great fee for a 30-year-old sale to the Bundesliga. Yeah, fantastic fee.
Fantastic fee. And if that's the sign of things to come, if that's the sign that Edu, who was always going to face scrutiny this summer for sales, is heading toward a direction where Arsenal are being more ruthless in sales, that's a great sign. And we got to hope that that lends itself to what we might see coming forward.
Well, look, you're never going to get great fees selling the players you don't want. You know what I mean? So I think you always have to be a little bit cognizant of that. My thing with Pepe, where I would probably go against myself on the idea that he has valued us, is the problem with Pepe, to the extent that I don't think he can play for Arteta's Arsenal, is not that he can't be effective in the final third. I think he can. It's that I don't think he's great off the ball. And I don't think you can be an Arteta player if you're not switched on off the ball. Is he going to press? Is he going to chase back when, someone's attacking the right wing and White has tucked in, or been caught in on the interior and someone's overlapped that? Is Pepe going to be back there guarding that space in the way Saka would be? And that's where I have an issue, because the funny thing is, I'd be interested in seeing a Nico Pepe play for Arsenal in the attack where we have 70% of possession in the final third. He's a player that I think would at least be interesting to see in that position. Doesn't mean he'd thrive, but I'd be curious to see it. But it's the off the ball stuff. The only reason I raise it is if I look at that cluster in attack, and I'd say Odegaard, Havertz, Vieira, Smith Rowe, all sort of nominally eights, I think, or earmarked as eights. Smith Rowe can play on the left wing, certainly. The weird thing is that all the players that I think you might see play if Saka were unavailable are players who themselves are otherwise starters. The natural backup for Saka right wing is probably Gabriel Jesus, or maybe Martinelli, who we've seen play pretty well on the right. I don't think Trossard fits there. I don't think Nelson is super natural there, although he has played there and he can. You're not going to see Nketiah there, obviously. Smith Rowe, don't think so. So it does still look like a position where everything is either a starter being moved over or a bit of a square peg in a round hole. Does that stand out to you as one where you say, let's say this guy Saka can't play 55 games this season, and God knows we're certainly going to try. But if he can't, do you see there being a natural player to step in for a 3-game run, 5-game run, God forbid a 10-game run if Saka's not there?
Honestly, it's not immediately obvious, no. I think that what Kai Havertz brings is the option to give Jesus an option outside. That you could move Havertz into kind of that Jesus molds and move Jesus then to cover Saka if he's out. The question is then who plays where Havertz is playing, because the guy that we've moved on, the guy that Havertz is effectively described as replacing. I suppose what you could do is you could move Jorginho if Partey's gone and we aren't bringing another midfielder. You can move Jorginho into the 6 and place Rice, alongside Jorginho with Odegaard as the midfield 3, and then Havertz moves centrally in that middle 3, and Jesus moves out wide right. Jesus in a wide area is something that I've wanted to see. I also think I know you mentioned him already today, but I feel like I quickly forget the existence of Trossard at times. we're so enamored by, we're so enthralled by Martinelli and Smith Rowe even at times, and Saka, of course, and Jesus, and now Havertz, that I think Trossard has slipped through the net a little bit in discussions about the season. And I did it myself just then when I was talking about how I think Havertz could move there and then Jesus goes right, because Havertz could stay next to Odegaard, Trossard could play at centre forward, and Jesus could move right. I know that Trossard replaced Saka in the game against Leeds at the Emirates, and Jesus was there, and Trossard got an assist in that game as well. But I think there is scope. I really like Trossard centrally. I know as he gets kind of into his 30s, I predict a more of a Santi Cazorla style, not regression in quality, but regression through the field into the midfield in terms of position. I can certainly see Trossard being a bit of a Santi who, for Malaga and Villarreal, was on the wide areas. And then as he got older and turned, even at Arsenal, he played in a wide area initially and then gradually moved into the deeper part of the midfield and partnered Coquelin. And I can see Trossard potentially becoming that style of player. I know Paul has talked about that on the podcast before and talked about how he feels that Trossard could be used as the left 8, if you like. But I think for the moment, I still like seeing Trossard there. I mean, that run of games we had where I think he started 6 in a row at centre forward and he got, or 7 in a row at centre forward and he got something like 6 assists, 3 against Fulham, of course. And then he was dropped for the game away at Anfield and we drew that game. We then played West Ham and drew that game. He didn't start that one either. He didn't start then against Southampton and we drew that game. And he didn't start at Man City and we lost that game. And then he started the next game against Chelsea and guess what? We won that game. So there is something to be said about the inclusion of Trossard when you're in good form, and maybe that we shouldn't take him out, even if it's Gabriel Jesus, the guy coming in to replace him. Because I think maybe that, I know Jesus scored against Liverpool at Anfield and certainly Trossard's absence wasn't the reason why we didn't win at Anfield. But I think in terms of keeping that momentum going in other fixtures, potentially, we could have brought him back in and kept him in. And we go back to that point again about Arteta having faith in some players that maybe he didn't, or rather should have had more faith in. But Trossard maybe on that right-hand side is not right, but through the middle, certainly I think is being overlooked somewhat.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel at times this conversation is kind of like saying, well, the caviar and filet and red wine and champagne were all excellent, but I guess they could have served a little more lobster meat with it. It's like, this is an excellent meal we're being served up. And
we're living very different lives, Elliot. I do,
Well, I'm not saying I eat like that. I'm saying clearly I don't eat like that because I don't think those things are ever paired together. Like, who is drinking their champagne with their red wine, with their caviar, with their steak and their lobster meat? And also, if you're like a vegetarian, none of that sounds good, but, or don't drink. But my point is that we've built a hell of a squad, and it looks like we're replacing the only 2 30-year-olds in the first 11 with early prime age players with elite talent in the kinds of skills that either we're losing or never had to begin with. The idea that we need to have 22 players of that quality, it's unrealistic. And there are always going to be areas where you don't quite have coverage. I know I tend to look at the way Liverpool built the squad that they challenged City with as the sort of apotheosis of squad building on a budget. Not that we're really on a budget anymore. But what they did is they just sort of accumulated a cluster of talented attackers and used that to create the leverage. Now, where they left themselves vulnerable was in defense, for example, right? So when Van Dijk wasn't available, they stunk. It was really that simple. There's always going to be that Achilles heel in a squad. I would argue if City didn't have Rodri or De Bruyne, they would have struggled this past season. But, they mostly did. I want to shift gears a little, though, to thinking about where we sit in the cluster of big clubs that will all want to be top 4 and some of whom will have aspirations for a title. Manchester City could take a step back. It's hard to envision coming off a treble, but they are coming off a treble. And I sometimes wonder, when you've scaled the mountain and when there are no more worlds left to conquer, how do you get the hunger again? You have players that are late prime there now who have done it all. You have a manager who has as well, although I think that fire will still burn inside him. But they're losing Gundogan. I think maybe they'll lose Bernardo Silva. I don't know. I think it's possible. They have obviously still have elite talent at most positions. It's not like I'm worried for them, concerned trolling for Manchester City. They haven't really put their foot on the gas in the transfer market. They could still drop 300 million this summer in the bat of an eye and all of a sudden look imperious again. But let's start with them. Any sense or suggestion for you that there could be a step back? And by step back, I don't mean they're third or fourth. I just mean they put up an 87 or 86 point season instead of into the 90s again.
I think optimism would be the only thing that would make me say yes. And, manifesting some kind of drop in form from them based upon, as you talked about, the loss of players like Gundogan, who was always really big for them in the run-in and in key moments. He scores big goals, be it the FA Cup final, be it away at Goodison Park when everyone was targeting that game as somewhere that City might drop points, and he's managed to miraculously kind of overhead kick without overhead kicking the ball into the back of the net. It was a really strange but beautiful goal that he scored. I think, though, that you are still going to see City come alive in this market. I think Josko Gvardiol is a player at RB Leipzig that they are going to be dropping another £100 million.
Yeah, just under the radar, 100 million defender. Yeah, good point. I totally forgot about that.
It's mad because, I look at Gvardiol as probably alongside Saliba as the best young defender in the world at the moment, which is great for us because it means we've already got the other one, and are keeping him as well, which is another massive thing for us. But Gvardiol in that team, you look at the players they're using. Ake has been fantastic, like more than most ever thought. I think the level that he's reached this season. Akanji has been brilliant. I know of Arsenal fans, plenty of them, that when he was leaving Dortmund, I think for around £20 million, we were just turning our nose up at, like, no, we don't need Akanji. I don't think I'd go for Akanji. I think I include myself in that. I never really looked at Akanji and thought, that's a player that we need, but he's been of a world-class standard last season. Obviously, Ruben Dias still there, and John Stones has done a brilliant job for them as well. So Gvardiol, despite costing, as you say, casually dropping another 100 million on a player, even then you can do that. And for City, it doesn't guarantee you minutes and doesn't guarantee you game time. I'm sure he will play because there's that investment that they've made, and it will be a transition for him going into that team. But I still think they will come alive in the market. Kovacic is a shrewd piece of business by them. I think that he replaces that immediate Gundogan loss. They bid for Rice. They wanted Rice. I mean, I know that they didn't push us to the 100 million because City have form for not paying over the odds for a player. They did it with Cucurella. They did it with Jorginho. They won't pay over the odds. We don't usually either, but we felt in this case that absolutely we had to beat City to this player, so we did. But that indicates that they are still capable of dropping £90 million on top of a Gvardiol type signing on a midfielder this window. So don't be surprised if that happens somewhere for somebody. And Haaland's another year older. Alvarez is another year older. They have a brilliant squad still, even though they've got a lot of aging players. They've still got plenty of young stars in that group that are going to be really key for them. So, yeah, it's difficult to rule them out. Rodri's still in his prime at 27. Yeah. So, as I say, I'd love to manifest some kind of dip, but it's tough.
Heavy sigh. Just want to put my head on the microphone and take a nap. Okay, so they're going to be a problem again, I guess is your point. Fair enough.
It's not a hot take, yeah.
No, it's not a hot take. No, we're going to be a problem for teams. Is there anyone else you see that might be a problem for us? I mean, I have to admit, I try to see the bear case because I look, it's fun to just say we're amazing. That's great. I don't think it's great analysis. I think you have to be willing to say, here are the variables, here are the questions. And I see a few, right? I mean, maybe Saliba's back is an issue if Saka isn't fully available all the time. That could be an area of issue. Do we have a true center forward that we know is? I mean, I think I have been Jesus' biggest defender, and I think he's outstanding. But he probably needs to give us more of that 15 to 20 goal season, or more. So there are areas. Can Havertz play the left 8? Can Declan Rice come in and replace Thomas Partey? There are all kinds of questions where things could go wrong, but frankly, I don't see that. I see us as quite good, and I feel very, very confident in saying we will be one of the top 4 teams next season. Whether we push for a title depends on, if I think Champions League causes us some issues just in terms of balancing between midweek and weekend fixtures. And how quickly the new signings bed in and look comfortable. But I think when push comes to shove, we're going to be one of the best teams in the league. If we're not the best, we'll be right there. What I'm curious about, as we start to wrap up, I think, is whether there are other clubs that are going to close that gap. Newcastle would be one you discuss. Frankly, I'm not sure I'm that convinced of that project at the moment. I think they've done better than I expected, but I think what they did was their ceiling with the talent that they have and the approach that they're taking and the manager they have. I think we saw the ceiling of what that team can do. Maybe, not the beginning of them trying to assault the summit, but I think that's the summit for that project. If they start changing how they approach that project, both in spending and in manager and things like that, of course they have the resources to go all the way to the top. I would say with Tottenham, they're a long way off. Frankly, I think that's a mess, and it's fantastic. Chelsea have become a daycare center. It's very, very strange. I mean, they're going full project youth. And when you go full project youth, it's very, very hard to get your predictions into a band of certainty because there's so much uncertainty about how young players will perform. Maybe they'll do something in the market that creates a little more clarity of the project. The team that does interest me a bit is Liverpool, because Liverpool last season, Tom, at their peak of performance, they still looked like the dominant Liverpool. They just had such a huge delta. The vicissitudes in performance between peak and trough were the greatest of any team in the league. And largely it was a defensive issue. But when that attack clicks, it still clicks in a really stunning way. And I don't think that we've unfortunately seen the best of Darwin Nunez necessarily. Gakpo was starting to come on a bit. Salah's still there. They're going out and making some interesting moves in the market. They quietly went about their business quite quickly when the window opened. They added Szoboszlai. I think midfield was a concern for them. I don't know if that gives them the midfield steel they need necessarily, but it certainly gives them the silk. Are they a team, especially with Alexander-Arnold now maybe becoming a midfielder properly so they can put a fullback in who can defend? Are they a team that can make this a 3 instead of a 2 at the top?
It'd be incredibly naive to say that they're not, because they are, without a doubt, before we came along, the obvious challengers to Man City every single time in this current iteration of the Premier League. Their signings are interesting. For those that watch my channel will know I'm like Szoboszlai's number one fan. But it's a signing. It's funny. I tweeted and it got a lot of debate, to be fair, going. I said the signings they've made struck me a bit like deals that Arsenal did when they were trying to get back into the top 4, which is obviously what Liverpool technically have to do because they finished outside of it last season. The McAllister, Szoboszlai, obviously with the inflated prices of the market these days as well taken into account, and they were both release clauses as well. They weren't like negotiations to get those prices. But as you said, I think there's something of they're adding them because they're there, but there's still question marks about Liverpool if they're adding players that they are crying out for. As you say, steel in midfield is something that they have desperately needed, and they've not secured that for me this summer yet. They still could.
Would Romeo Lavia fill that? I mean, because we scouted him over on Patreon. He is a toolsy player, as Americans would say, meaning he has a lot of the physical tools to be excellent, but I find him to be very raw. But having said that, in a pressing system where maybe he's not the one who has to have the technical level, he certainly has a physical capability. Would he add that steal in your view?
One day, but I don't think next season. If we're talking about Liverpool competing with us next season, Arsenal have just added the best centre midfielder in the Premier League, bar Rodri. It's Rice and Rodri and Partey last season were the ones you look at. Fabinho's fallen off of a cliff in terms of what he's produced. And if you're saying that, if you're comparing Lavia to Rice, it's apples and onions. It's very, very different in terms of what both teams have added in those positions. So you would say if that's the midfielder they've added, who have Liverpool closed the gap or have Arsenal opened the gap? You'd say Arsenal have opened the gap in midfield with the signings they're making, which is great for us. I don't want to come across like I'm underestimating Liverpool because, as I said at the start of the monologue, that would be naive to do so. I just think that there are obviously still question marks about that side, but because there's so much talent and so much potential within it, they can just pop. And if they keep popping every single week, they're going to keep scoring 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s. And that's what Arsenal didn't do last season when we were going up against a side like City that can happily score 3, 4, 5, 6 goals. Arsenal weren't really doing that. We weren't blowing teams away. We only in a few games did we manage to get like a 3-goal difference between us and the opposition. Liverpool can do that very comfortably, like beating Manchester United 7-0, these types of performances. So that's what Arsenal really need to do next season is have that Liverpool-inspired thrashing on a regular basis of other sides. But yeah, in terms of Liverpool, they're going to be there. You touched upon some others. Spurs are an unknown one. I know they're our comedy club and we love to laugh at them. Whoever I speak to about Ange Postecoglou has nothing but amazing things to say about him, that he's a really, really good coach. It's just about whether or not that can translate into the Premier League and into Tottenham, which is another whole thing entirely.
Mikel Arteta is a really, really good coach. And he finished 8th when he had an absolutely dreadful squad. And I don't think, I'm not saying Spurs will necessarily finish 8th. However good Ange Postecoglou is, I think he's built, they have built something that's built to fail. And then when Kane goes, if he goes this summer, I think there's just no overstating the significance that he has in that squad and it being able to work at all. So we'll see. It's funny. It shows you how much I think of the United project that I didn't even mention them. And the Liverpool Echo is reporting that Liverpool had put in a 200 million bid for Kylian Mbappe. So, hope springs eternal for everyone. Yeah. Ultimately, when I look at it, I can't escape the conclusion that what we have built is the second best, if not the best team in the league, the second best team in the league right now. Football's unpredictable. Injuries change the picture. Champions League changes the picture. Liverpool, I think they'll play kids in the Europa League. I think Klopp will literally throw that away, at least at the group stage. That's an advantage they haven't had in years for a team that has at times looked too fatigued by the style he wanted them to play or not able to play the style he wanted them to play. So it'll be interesting. But yeah, overall, I think what we've done is brilliant. I think there's maybe little bits to do at the edges. Like I said, with my terrible food analogy, please don't come to my restaurant. Clearly don't know what I'm doing. But like we're adding the lobster to the steak and caviar and champagne and wine at this point. Like there's probably still work to be done, but it is looking like a hell of a meal, and I'm excited to eat it. Not that I want to eat any of the players. I want to eat. It's a metaphor for how I want to consume. You know what? Tom is on Twitter at Tom Canton Media. Read him at Football.London. Tim Stillman is coming up in just a moment. But Tom, good to see you via camera. Look forward to seeing you in person again soon. And thanks for coming on.
Pleasure, as always, mate.
Thanks. And definitely check out Tom's YouTube channel as well. Okay, so I should mention, by the way, though, that this podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp isn't online therapy. It's just therapy. It just happens to be online. How is that so hard to understand? It's yes, of course it's online therapy, but it's therapy that's on. Look, this is very simple. BetterHelp is therapy. It's just that you access the therapy online. I feel like I've made this very clear. But the thing about BetterHelp that I want to be clear about is that because you can access it online, it makes it more accessible. You don't have to get the car. You don't have to drive to an office. Oh, where's the office? Oh, I got lost. Okay, you know what? I guess I'll stop at this donut shop. Now I've had 3 donuts, but I haven't had any therapy. And actually, the fact that I've had 3 donuts is making me feel not so good about myself. Maybe I should have gone to a therapist instead of the donut shop. But that's not going to happen because you're going to do it online. And because you're doing it online, you can pair with a therapist that's right for you. You can pair with a specialist that has a specialty that is specialized for your special needs. See there were a lot of words special there. I like the word special sometimes. So yes, you can get everything you need from BetterHelp, including easier access to more affordable, flexible therapy, camera on, camera off, whatever you're comfortable with. The most important thing is start doing it because therapy is important and you need to do it to be a healthy person. And therapy can be your map with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/vision today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/vision. Now, once you are all therapized, you're just going to strut out into the world feeling great about yourself. When you're strutting out into the world feeling great about yourself, the thing you need to do is wear sunglasses because sunglasses make you look cool. They did a scientific study. They lined up 10,000 people, half of them with sunglasses, half of them without. When they asked random people who looks cooler, the sunglass people look cooler. But the people that look coolest were the people wearing Oakleys. And you know how I know that? Because Kylian Mbappe wears Oakley. future Liverpool star, Kylian Mbappe. Lol, no way. But the point is, Kylian Mbappe wears Oakley. You should wear Oakley. They have great styles. They have great quality. They have styles that, I think are traditional. But what I like about Oakley is they have styles that are not traditional. So you can stand out and actually have a sense of personal style, something that I am not intimately familiar with. But they also have great quality. They have prism lens technology. Prism lenses, phenomenal polarization. So they're so clear. Put them on my dad the other day. And while I will say it was weird seeing my 81-year-old dad in really cool Oakley sunglasses, he loved how clear it made everything. And now he's like, these are mine now. And I said, they're not yours now. They're mine now, Dad. And that's a whole thing we can go to therapy for. But setting it aside, you should go to Oakley. Head over there. You can read about prism technology. You can pick up a pair of sunglasses. You can absolutely love them. You can do it at Oakley.com. Go to Oakley.com for more information today. Clive, is that enough of that? Indeed, mate. Football, mate. Podcast mate. Nailed it. Okay, and now, as promised, I am joined by Tim. You can find him on Twitter at Stillmanator. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like there's a grim future in which I'm going to be like, and now I'm joined by Tim. You can find him on Twitter at Stillmanator and on Blue Sky at Tim the Guy and on Mastodon at Timothy and on Threads at Timote.
That's at the moment, that's all unlikely. I actually considered bringing this up with you off mic, but considering we're in a slight dead space for news, which sounds like a weird thing to say because we're about to get a flurry of announcements, but yeah, I'm very dubious about these Twitter alternatives. So
they're gonna
I'm hedging my bets a bit, but I'm not on Threads as of today. If people are still talking about it like next week, I might give it a look, but I'm a bit dubious, I have to say.
They'll have to drag me from Twitter, kicking and screaming as the last person on it. And by the way, not because I don't see all the toxic things about it and terrible things about it, and people listening who hate it. Like, I see all of that.
Yep.
I've made friends there. I have a community there. Like,
exactly.
You met your wife there. I met you and Clive and Paul there, and
you
Andrew
can't
there.
migrate that in one go.
Yeah.
You just can't.
And it is, without getting too much into it, I will say it is sad, right? Because I want it to thrive because
Same.
it is a place that became the place I went to be with my friends that I met in a digital space, but have become my friends in a very, in a real space in my true life. And so I don't want that to be destroyed because it means something to me. But, one way or another, we'll all find a way to stay connected. And I can use this time to reiterate how much we appreciate you being connected to us through the podcast. And, that means the world to us, obviously. So speaking of someone who meant the world to you, meant the world to me as well. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, it's kind of gone under the radar because of, the whole £105 million signing thing. But Arsene Wenger, it's reported, is getting a statue outside the Emirates. This should not be controversial. And to be fair, I'm not trying to embrace debate. I have not seen any controversy surrounding it. I do feel, and maybe this is a two-way feeling with Arsene himself as well, I can't help but feel that there is still a chill in the relationship between the club and the man and the fans and Arsene. Now, look, I'll just throw it out there. I adore Arsene Wenger. I love him like a father. A big part of why I'm here today loving the club is thanks to him and what he brought to the club. I can see his faults and his flaws. I can see the things he got wrong. It's a two things can be true. I can love him and think he gave us some of the highest highs we've ever experienced as Arsenal supporters. And I know there are people of a certain age listening who weren't along for that journey and for whom Arsene was maybe the more tricky guy in the last 5 or 7 seasons of his tenure. And I can understand how that would complicate the relationship. If you had to take the temperature of the entire Arsenal diaspora and represent all fans everywhere, which is always a good thing for a single person to do, where do you think the temperature is on that relationship right now?
Yeah, I think taking your slightly tongue-in-cheek phrasing of this question, I think I'm a good person to ask because I may be like a Wenger centrist, if that makes sense. And I know if there's one thing people love, it's centrists at the moment. So, because I was never one of those firmly this guy is responsible for everything bad in my life and I've made him the boogeyman, which I think quite a few Arsenal fans did towards the end. But at the same time, I wasn't like, this guy is the protector of all things pure and I will defend him with my dying breath. I was a bit more of a, it took me maybe a bit longer to get to I just think this guy has to go now. But I've said many times before, I have carried a little bit, not with me personally every single day when I go to sleep at night. Like I have a life and all of that, but like in my football thoughts, I have kind of had that for a few years, like that. I think you kind of ruined it by not going a bit earlier. Like I feel like that's a bit of a stain, but I was always open-minded about the fact that time would probably sort that out. Like we talked about Fabregas the other day, right? In terms of time heals all wounds, it's kind of done that with Ashley Cole as well. And like, let's have it clear, Wenger is a bigger figure than those two put together times several. And you're right, he is, by hook or by crook, he is responsible for a generation of Arsenal fans, particularly around the world, I think, and that's an amazing thing. And for me, like I really had Wenger fatigue for a few years, and for this podcast, I went and interviewed Gabriel Clark, who put together that brilliant documentary about him. And I kind of said to Gabriel, I can't remember whether I said it on mic or off mic, but I said, like, I have to say I was kind of dreading watching this because I still have that Wenger fatigue. I still have that kind of, I need space, I need time from this, because I found the last 2 seasons in particular incredibly unpleasant. But I feel like some stuff has happened that happens over the natural passage of time anyway, that has allowed that slight lingering bad feeling to go away. And the biggest part of that, Elliot, is that we're good. That's what it is. Like, so it feels like we have moved on because we're good again. And it's really nice that we're good again with guys that he brought to the club. You know, Arteta, Mertesacker, Edu, all Jack Wilshere, they're all in like important roles, and they're all Wenger's people. Wenger explicitly brought 3 of those guys to the club. And so, you know, that connection lives on. And I think Mikel Arteta has done a lot of good work to re-establish that connection. And don't get me wrong, even if he'd wanted to, Unai Emery could not do this. He could not do that. There had to be a separation. There had to be a distance. I think Arsene Wenger understood that. And that wasn't just, I'm sure Wenger understood it mainly for himself, which is natural, but I think it was necessary for Arsenal as well. There's just no way that Emery could have like invited Wenger to the training ground and things like that. But with Arteta, there's enough separation there. The fact that he captained the team under Wenger. And like I said, the fact that we're good again, like, Wenger coming to the stadium last season, I know that was a long time coming, but it happened at the perfect time because we were top of the league. We were playing brilliant football. You know, we've got this like young team, and like that was the perfect time for him to come back. And I think it was handled perfectly as well. There was no fanfare leading up to it. It's, we score a goal, everyone's happy, his face comes up on both the stadium screen and the TV screen, just perfectly handled. And clearly Arteta has both the confidence and the distance to have brought this back and said, okay, actually, there is like that distance is already there. Everyone knows he's not coming in telling me what to do or anything like that, or it's not like the critical big brother eye. It's, I'm in control of this club now and I want you here because you're important to me and you're important to this club. And that's perfectly handled. So I think this is a good time for it. I think some people, maybe even the man himself, might think, actually, maybe this is better after I die.
Yeah.
And, he talked about that Burnley game feeling like his funeral. He was like, it's like being alive for your funeral type thing. And I get that. And I get for someone like Wenger, who in his career has always been very like forward looking. And I think most coaches and elite sports people are built like that anyway. And look, he's still working, but he hasn't gone to coach another club. And I think that's his decision. I'm sure he'd have had no shortage of offers, but he would have just felt any other job would not have suited him. So he's gone to FIFA, blah, blah, blah. But I hope that it's much more that he is, because the flip side is, why do we wait till people die to say nice things about them? And I feel like the man deserves, particularly with the way the last couple of years went, I think the man deserves, whether he feels a bit bashful or a bit awkward about it, he deserves to see what he did for this club. And perhaps with a bit of distance, some of us can see it even more, the difficult stuff like moving stadiums and all of that. Like, we all know look, he didn't literally build the stadium with his own hands, as some people would have you believe, or pay for it with his own money, but he was the progenitor for that, absolutely. And the Emirates Stadium, if nothing else, is his legacy. And he absolutely, I know there's a little bronze bust of him at the entrance, but he absolutely deserves a statue outside this stadium. And I think it's the perfect time to do it. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that if naming rights weren't a big source of revenue, it could be the Arsene Wenger Stadium. Like, I'd have absolutely no problem.
Or a stand.
With that. Yeah, Arsene Wenger stand, of course. And that may happen at some point. It is important to be aware of history. Arsenal were a giant club before Arsene Wenger, but there was no guarantee that we would be dragged into modernity. There were clubs of a similar stature who did not make that journey. It didn't make it into modernity. You know?
Yeah, I remember writing an article about this a few years ago, and I looked at Arsenal's honours list in 1996 when Wenger joined. You're quite right. Like, mainly Arsenal were carried by the 30s, right? The 30s is where they won the majority of their trophies when they were the dominant team. And actually, kind of between the 40s and the 80s, Arsenal didn't win that much. And if you compare Arsenal to like Aston Villa and Everton in 96, trophy-wise, we're on a pretty similar plinth, but Arsenal pulled away again, and that's because of Arsene Wenger.
And did it at a critical time when the game was exploding globally, exploding in TV coverage, when teams were going to either be one of the big ones or not. You know what I mean? If Everton had made a Champions League final and had Thierry Henry and Dennis Bergkamp and Pires and Vieira and won titles and won doubles, they might now be of the stature that we are regarded. There was no guarantee of our place there. And I think the period where he maybe did some of his best work was post-Invincibles until, let's say, the mid-teens, before it started to decline, when the club had no real sense of itself in terms of the ownership situation was murky, right? You had Kroenke trying to consolidate some ownership. Usmanov was the other pole. They butted heads. There was no real willingness to spend. Every summer we had a sort of neutral or negative net spend, whatever you want to say. And we stayed in the Champions League for all those years at a time when being in the Champions League was critical to staying in the, in the view, the global view and relevance in the sport. And he shepherded us through that period. And so he gave us this period of immense success that I think still imprinted so strongly on a young generation of players that they wanted to come play at Arsenal, a young generation of fans that they wanted to be Arsenal fans. And granted, now that is becoming sepia toned. I mean, the Invincibles are essentially 20 years ago. So there are people watching, loving, and supporting Arsenal today that didn't experience that, but they did experience Cesc Fabregas, or they did experience Ozil and Alexis. And while that started to tail off into a pretty tough time, Arsenal always played pretty good attacking football until the very bitter end, always were in the Champions League. And to get there was important, because I think what we've seen is the land of milk and honey. The promised land is now. Usmanov had to go away for us to get there. Maybe other things too, but I certainly think that played a role. And I don't think there was anyone that could have come into the Arsenal that we were then and guided us through what Arsene did. And we see that because there was a vacuum of power and leadership at the club. KSE weren't super plugged in, really understanding what was happening at the time, is my guess. I don't know that, but it sort of felt that way, in part because they had split ownership. There was no director of football. There was no model. There was no modern model. And when Arsene left, that vacuum became self-evident. It was filled up by charlatans and dilettantes and Philistines and any other 5-point word or SAT word we would say here in the United States that you want to put in there. But and it didn't work, and it crumbled, and we had to rebuild that. And I think in Mikel Arteta, we've been very fortunate to get someone who can take on some of that leadership role. But I think also it's been stabilized because there is leadership at the very top. I do think that KSE, maybe in Josh more than Stan at this point, just guessing, have their eye on things a bit. And there are other people who are watching a little more closely. And so, and that extends, of course, to Vinay, obviously, and Eddie. Yeah. But it was a tough time. It could have been a very tough time for the club. And the fact that we were able to get through that period, retaining our stature in the game, I think was really, really important. I'm with you. Those last few seasons, enough was enough. And the funny thing is, it's not even because he was doing a terrible job. It was a terrible situation. Yeah. And both Emery and Arteta struggled with it themselves for a number of seasons. But after 20 years with someone, even doing okay is going to feel terrible, because you just want it to be, if you're going to fail in a way, you want to fail differently. You know what I mean? Yeah. Failing with Emery sucked, but it was different at least. And then, failing with Arteta for a while and then eventually succeeding. So I've just said a lot of things and I haven't asked a question, but I will ask a question. Let me ask this. I think one of the things people loved about Arsene Wenger is we always felt there was a class about him. And there was a class about him. I'm not trying to diminish that. Yep. Does his move to FIFA complicate things for you at all, given the way FIFA is regarded? And it is hard to be there without the stain of it rubbing off on you. And one of the reasons I loved Arsene, among so many reasons, is I loved his ideology. I loved his worldview, right? He just had a way of saying things and a way of looking at things that I could really connect to. Does the FIFA connection tarnish that in any way for you?
A little bit, yeah. I don't pay that much attention to it though, and I don't think that's like a denial thing. I guess I'm just like not asked about FIFA really, like, and like I never thought that he was like some, I never thought of him as like a socialist icon or anything like that.
Not at $7 million a year or whatever he was making.
Exactly. Like I know where his house was in High Barnet, and again, I'm not criticizing him for that. Like not being a social. I'm not a socialist icon either. Mm-hmm. But sign up for Patreon, by the way. But yeah, I guess it's a little bit like I don't know, when like your favorite musician when you're a teenager ends up on an advert or something. I compare it to that kind of low level. Oh man, not quite up there with like two of my teenage idols were like Morrissey from the Smiths. Well, actually, to be fair, he was never really an idol to me, but his music, and kind of still is, and that's troublesome because he's a fuckwit of the highest order. And Ian Brown was another one of my musical heroes. And he, let's just say during COVID, a bit Letitia brained. So, like sometimes your heroes do just let you down a little bit. But I think a long time ago, I kind of came to the conclusion that you shouldn't hold your heroes to like your exact standards. Like, as long as they're like not Morrissey and genuinely hold like just appalling opinions about things that are actually genuinely quite hurtful. Like it's a bit like when Johnny Rotten turned up in an advert for butter when I was 18, I was kind of like, yeah, I'm just going to have to take that on the chin and kind of say, it's not my life, it's not my choice kind of thing. So a little bit, but then again, I also do think the role he's doing in FIFA, I don't get the impression that he's like handing watches over to Jack Warner or anything. I believe that he probably believes, and he might well be right in this, that he's doing some good for the game or trying to do some good for the game. The World Cup every 2 years thing, though, that was a little bit of a taint, wasn't it? It's like no one thinks that's good for the game, do they? No, other than making loads of money. So slightly disappointing, but nothing that's really gonna colour my opinion of him that much, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess it's like the Arsene Wenger debate felt so urgent and existential once upon a time. With distance, what's happened is I see the flaws of the man. I love what he did. I enjoyed the years he was at Arsenal mostly. I think he's clearly an Arsenal legend and a guy who deserves a statue. And like, I think what it is I can think about him without being enervated. There was a time when even uttering his name touched off such a hot debate and discussion. There were people that adored him and could hear nothing else said, and people that, for some weird reason that I can't connect to, and if you're one of these people, I apologize, but loathed him and, could not hear his name without wanting to slander it. And like, now the heat of that debate is off. I can see the reality of the situation, which is we were very lucky to have him. He took Arsenal into the modern era of football, kept keeping us at an extremely high level, brought us some of the best seasons in club history, and then extended our relevance through a period where the club was drifting otherwise, and did it in a really interesting way through youth, through attacking football, through flair, when there really weren't the resources to have that at a time when the guy with all the resources, Jose Mourinho and Abramovich, were building the most dour, unpleasant football to win. And I think the fact that we stood in opposition to that with no money was also really compelling,
Yeah, and I guess the further away I always had this kind of thought in the back of my mind. Some of those like quite bad buys in the last couple of years, and like the bad contract situations and all of that, and buying Aubameyang and Lacazette and bringing Mkhitaryan in, Mustafi and all of that. And I don't want to be a total apologist, but I do wonder how much all of that was his decision, if you know what I mean. Like, I do get the impression that there were maybe some buys where it's, a little bit like, this is your idea, Arsene, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like Gazidis, and again, maybe this was necessary because we were all saying this man has too much control. It's like 2015 or whatever it is. One man cannot oversee a whole football club, and we all wanted that bit of delegation. And I do wonder whether like Gazidis and other people in the background were like trying to wrestle back that control and being like, stats DNA, Arsene, you're like this. And he was probably like, no, I don't like that.
Don't like that.
I do suspect there was a tension between those things. The necessary need to wrestle back some of that control off of him, but at the same time, maybe not doing it in the best way. Maybe even mimicking the actual ownership situation, where it was like there was maybe a little bit of tension there. And I do wonder if you gave him 3 good glasses of red wine in a quiet bar somewhere, whether Wenger would have something to say about all of that. I wonder whether he'd say like, yeah, Kolasinac wasn't my idea, kind of thing. Or, I kind of had my arm twisted on that one a little bit. So I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe I am just being a bit of an apologist, but I do feel like there were moves that were made that perhaps were made in collaboration where he wasn't 100% sure about them or behind them.
Yeah, look, ultimately, like I said, you can hopefully step away from it now enough emotionally to just see with clear eyes the genius of the man and the brilliance of what he did for the club, and also recognize that by the end, changes had to be made, mistakes were made, whether his or others, and now, with the benefit of some distance and some hindsight, he's a guy who should probably have a stand named after him. He's a guy who should have a statue, outside the ground, and we should love him for what he contributed. We have managers we celebrate who literally were sacked for doing unethical things that you're not supposed to do, right? Who we celebrate now. So,
The other thing I think that era taught me, both in football and just in like life, in corporate structures, is everyone has a shelf life. Sorry if that sounds like really nihilistic. I mean in like a career kind of sense here, that essentially if you've ever worked in an organization, right, like the director or the CEO or whoever at the top, that's a shelf life position. Like, and it's the same with being like the prime minister or being the political party that is in power. Like, I believe quite strongly that no political party should really have more than 2 terms, because after that, like, look, wherever your political leanings are, if you look at England at the moment, we've just had one political party in power for too long. And stuff happens and people have shit over each other, which means you appoint rubbish people to certain, but like the power dynamics start to take over, and it happens in big organizations, in governments, and I think it happens in football clubs. And like, that's why I'm trying to grab hold of now, where I feel like Arsenal are on an upward trajectory, because I know one of 2 things is going to happen with Mikel Arteta. He's going to go at a peak and we're all going to be mortified, or it's just going to start to decline a bit like it did with Wenger, and it's going to peter out. Like, unfortunately, there are very few happy endings.
What's the
I guess this was put...
He stays amazing forever? You know what I mean?
Yeah, like
at
people
the end,
don't...
Yeah, he's either going to leave when we don't want him to, or he's going to stay longer than we want him to, because those are the only 2 possibilities.
Exactly. This was put much more profoundly in the movie version of Train Spotting, where Spud just says, like, I'm not going to do the accent, but like, George Best, Lou Reed, they had it, then they didn't.
Yeah.
And he was talking about essentially how like musicians should die. And like, Cobain, Hendrix, Joplin, they all died at 27 actually. And it's just like Lennon, and it's like they never got like old.
They never had the sad old phase, which is unfortunate. Would have loved to have seen all of them live to have it.
But of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's Tim, like this is the thing with football, with sport, but football in particular. The intensity of the passion we have about it means that we are not able to just shrug our shoulders, right? We're not able to just be like, well, kind of in decline now, so the next few seasons probably won't be great, and then he'll leave. So we'll get through these next few declining seasons and move on. To, like you're not able to shrug your shoulders because it means too much to you, right? And by the way, if you get to that point, it's probably time to give it up, right? Because you should care more than that. But as a result, those declining moments are felt acutely. Whereas with the benefit of hindsight, no one's going to think back on the last 2 Arsene Wenger seasons. Like, honestly, they're much of a muchness, as you might say. But at the time, we were living through them. They were our Arsenal life. And they didn't feel like much of a muchness then. They felt really important and not very fun. So, look, a long way of saying deserves a statue, clearly. Wonderful genius of a man for our club, and a guy that I am able to now reconnect more keenly with the loving feeling I had about him at Arsenal than some of the more complex feelings I had towards the end. And, I realize there are people for whom the FIFA Association will be something they probably would rather not have on his CV, but, I don't know how to evaluate that yet. I guess in the fullness of time, maybe I'll bring that into the picture a little bit more too. I don't think there's a lot else out there. I do want to say the Alessia Russo signing has gotten a lot of attention, as it should. It's really exciting. And Tim, I think you and Clive and myself, to the extent that I'll be driving, I think we'll do a scouting video. What I didn't realize is Scout does have the video. So we will on our Patreon do a scouting video for her. That'll be really exciting. Our first women's scouting video. So that's long overdue and glad to be doing it. We have obviously done Timber and Havertz and 2 on Rice. We have put out our second Rice scouting video because the first one only went to March, so we wanted to get his run in, which was really quite exceptional. I've done a number of other scouting videos on there as well, and we'll continue to do that. We're doing our weekly player season reviews, so we've done Saka and Xhaka and
Martinelli.
Yeah, Martinelli. That's good. Thank you. There's just been a lot of stuff we're doing over there. A lot of content over there, as you can imagine. And there will continue to be. So thank you for being there. Thank you for being here. I don't think there's much else for us to cover, frankly, Tim. I mean, the interesting thing is, I guess we can just leave it on this. It shows you how crazy the transfer window is, that it's just like we're about to officially announce a £100 million signing, another 40 million or 35-ish million pound signing. We've announced 165 million signing, and it all feels a little snooze festy right now, boring, but is the next real wave of activity, and the wave that's going to be really critical and that will be really exciting, is the outgoings, because I think that's going to really shape the squad, obviously, but also I think any future business we might try to get done this window.
Yeah. I've literally, my column's just gone out like looking at this, where I basically said I think there'll be one more senior arrival later in the window, but it will be entirely dictated by who goes. So let's say we get rid of all 3 of Cedric, Rob Holding and Kieran Tierney, then I think we'll get another defender. If we decide to move Thomas Partey on, I think it'll be a midfielder. If neither of those things happen, my kind of out there theory is that Eddie Nketiah might go and we might get another centre forward, but that feels like not priority business. But in the kind of world where actually all of our most of our current defenders and all our current midfielders, not including Xhaka, at the moment will stay, then maybe that will get sorted. So it will absolutely be shaped by outgoings, and I don't think it's going to be the sort of signing that Arteta would, is like, I want them playing against Nuremberg type thing, like maybe first game of the season, but almost more like a January signing. I think the 3 big pieces are there, but you touched on something else as well there about how like actually 2 of these signings haven't even been announced yet, but like we know so much about them that like the announcement feels like a formality. And actually reporting on the Russo transfer, the first time I'd really experienced that, and actually the first time it really felt like I was reporting on a transfer that had like a lot of public interest. And the really weird thing about the Russo one in particular, because, you know, I broke the story, but like, but this was the thing is that this is the first time ever, right, that I'd done a story on Arsblog about we're close to signing someone. I don't usually do that story. I usually know that, but I kind of do, or I put it in somewhere like I expect this to happen in the next couple of days. With Russo, I knew it was big. I knew my information was good. And I was like, no, I want to break this. Like, fuck everyone else.
That's fun. Yeah.
I want to break this one, because so usually I wouldn't do that is close to happening story, particularly when I knew, because of her contract situation, I knew it wasn't going to be announced until July. And so what happened with that transfer is in a complete holding pattern, because they basically agreed it in early June, but they couldn't progress beyond verbal agreement until basically Monday, July the 3rd, because she was away with England and because of her contract. But the amount of people who are like, what's the update on Russo? What's the update on Russo? And every day I was like, there's no update. And if you want us to sign her, you want that to stay the case, because the only update now is like something's gone wrong, essentially. But like the extent to which, because we're used to in the men's game being drip fed this kind of close to preparing to launch a bid for type thing, like people were really like just thirsty for info. And I was like, guys, there's no more info. Like, it's verbally agreed and it will get announced unless something happens. And it was just really interesting, first of all, for the first time to experience that with a women's transfer, but also the nature of transfer reporting, where I wouldn't compare myself to the great man, but I'd like to be more Ornstein than Romano. I'd like to be more like fees agreed, medical done,
when you say
rather than like
it's fact.
It's, and just like the essentials rather than the fluff in between. But it was, sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but just like an interesting kind of perspective as someone who usually views, like everyone else, transfer reporting from the outside, like probably the biggest one I've ever reported on in terms of public interest, and that real like thirst for information and just being like, guys, there is none. Sorry.
I can see how that could get addictive to be involved in that, although I couldn't be involved in something that's that just relentless. But I guess my biggest issue with you is you don't feel ready yet because you don't have your catchphrase. I think once you have your catchphrase, you don't have your here we go. So we're going to need to work on that. We'll need to work on that.
But then Ornstein doesn't have that either, you know? Like, he's just, like I said, his timelines...
He's the Orn bomb. So he's just got the replies. Like the meme for Ornstein are the replies. You just go to the replies and they're always, that's his thing is other people's replies. All right.
True.
I think we've definitely hit the leave it there part of the podcast.
Yes.
We'll probably do a Xhaka retrospective type thing when it's announced that he's leaving. We'll probably do, it's weird, right? I'm like, what if they announce the Rice signing right after I publish this? And then I'm like, we've done like 40 pods on Rice, 2 scouting videos. Like, frankly, that's the problem, right? Like, I'm not putting out an emergency pod to cover a guy we've been covering nonstop for 2 months.
Yeah.
So it is what it is. I think we've got a lot coming up. We'll do that Alessio Russo scouting video and a lot more. So lots to happen still, and that long rumored announcement of the LA event, which I assure you is now very, very close. And Tim will be at. So Tim's on Twitter at Stominator. Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure as always.
My name's Elliot Smith. You can block me on Twitter. Gooner. Thanks, everybody. Love you. Hope you're having a great summer. For me, probably be snowing in about 3 weeks, so trying to enjoy it as much as I can. Wherever you are, I hope you're healthy and well, and we love you. And we will talk to you after Arsenal 10. Transfer window.